Fort Bliss is a massive United States Army post. It sprawls across a vast expanse of desert terrain. Its land covers parts of both Texas and New Mexico. The main post sits just northeast of El Paso, Texas, a city that hugs the United States-Mexico border. This location is not accidental. It has placed the base at the crossroads of American military history and, more recently, at the very center of America's complex immigration story. For over a century, its primary mission was to train soldiers. It prepared them for conflicts ranging from the world wars to modern-day campaigns in the Middle East. The sheer size of Fort Bliss is difficult to comprehend. At over 1 million acres, it is larger than the state of Rhode Island, a city unto itself with its own infrastructure, housing, and history. The installation's history is deeply woven into the fabric of the American West. Established in the mid-19th century, it played a role in the nation's westward expansion and conflicts with Native American tribes. Over the decades, it evolved. It became a premier center for air defense artillery training. Soldiers cycled through its ranges, learning to operate sophisticated missile systems. Its identity was clear. It was a place of military readiness. It was a symbol of American power projection. The desert landscape served as a perfect, isolated backdrop for live-fire exercises and large-scale military maneuvers. This long-standing identity as a military training hub makes its more recent role even more striking and, for many, deeply controversial. The primary reason Fort Bliss became the largest migrant detention facility in the United States is rooted in numbers. In recent years, particularly in early 2021, the United States southern border saw a dramatic increase in the number of unaccompanied children arriving. These are minors who cross the border without a parent or legal guardian. Under United States law, these children cannot be immediately turned away. They are taken into the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services. The existing network of state-licensed shelters designed for smaller numbers was quickly overwhelmed. The system reached a breaking point, creating a backlog of children stuck in crowded, jail-like border patrol stations that were never intended for their care. The government needed space, and it needed it fast. The Biden administration, facing a mounting humanitarian and political crisis, activated a plan to create emergency intake sites. These were meant to be temporary, large-scale facilities to get children out of Border Patrol custody and into a safer, more appropriate environment while they awaited placement with sponsors, usually family members already in the United States. Fort Bliss, with its vast, federally controlled land and existing infrastructure, emerged as a prime candidate. The Pentagon agreed to provide the location, and the Department of Health and Human Services took the lead in setting up and running the massive temporary shelter. The people held at Fort Bliss were primarily unaccompanied minors. This group includes children and teenagers, some as young as 5 years old, from Central American countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. They often make the perilous journey north to escape violence, poverty, or instability in their home countries, seeking safety and reunification with family. The collaboration between the Pentagon and civilian agencies like the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Homeland Security is central to the operation. This multi-agency effort highlights the complexity of the response, where military resources are leveraged to address what is fundamentally a humanitarian and civil immigration issue. For the thousands of children housed at Fort Bliss, daily life was a stark departure from any sense of normalcy. They lived in massive, soft-sided tents or rigid warehouse-like structures, often referred to as dormitories. These spaces were filled with row upon row of cots, creating a vast, impersonal living environment. A typical day was highly structured, governed by a schedule that dictated wake-up times, meals, and activities. Mornings would begin with breakfast, often served in a large mess hall. The goal was to provide a routine, which can be comforting for children in unfamiliar and stressful situations. However, the sheer scale of the operation made individualized attention incredibly difficult. Educational and recreational activities were part of the daily schedule, but reports from inside painted a mixed picture of their quality and consistency. Organizers attempted to provide basic schooling and language classes. They also set up designated areas for recreation, like soccer fields and spaces for playing games. The intention was to provide some semblance of a childhood experience and to keep the children occupied. Yet with thousands of children to manage, resources were stretched thin. Many children reportedly spent long hours with little to do, confined to their crowded living quarters. The environment was often loud and chaotic, a far cry from the nurturing setting a child needs. The focus of the operation was on health, safety, and eventual reunification. Children received medical screenings upon arrival. Mental health services were also available, a critical component given the trauma many had experienced both in their home countries and during their journey to the United States. The most important part of their stay, from a legal and personal standpoint, was the case management process. Caseworkers were assigned to each child to begin the painstaking work of locating and vetting a suitable sponsor, typically a parent or close relative living in the United States. This process involved background checks and paperwork, and it could often take weeks, leaving children in a state of prolonged uncertainty. Daily life was a waiting game, a period of limbo suspended between the life they fled and the future they hoped to build. The experience inside Fort Bliss for both children and families was defined by this sense of waiting in a vast, temporary, and impersonal space. The Fort Bliss facility quickly became a focal point of intense scrutiny and criticism from advocates, lawyers, and lawmakers. One of the most persistent issues was the living conditions. Despite the government's efforts, reports emerged detailing significant problems. These included allegations of overcrowding in the large tents, with hundreds of children sleeping on cots packed closely together. Concerns were raised about sanitation, with reports of overflowing toilets and limited access to showers. The quality of the food was also a frequent complaint. Whistleblowers and visitors described an environment that felt more like a warehouse for children than a shelter designed for their well-being, raising questions about whether the government was meeting basic standards of care. Another major area of criticism centered on the provision of care, particularly for mental and physical health. Advocates reported that the facility was severely understaffed with case managers, leading to significant delays in processing children for release to their sponsors. This created a bottleneck, extending the time children spent in the institutional setting, which experts say can be detrimental to their development. There were also disturbing reports about the lack of adequate mental health support for traumatized children, and allegations of staff being ill-equipped to handle the complex needs of the population. The scale of the operation simply overwhelmed the capacity to provide the individualized care that vulnerable children require. The use of a military base itself was a source of criticism. While the Department of Defense provided the location, the optics were challenging. Housing children seeking safety on an active Army post struck many as inappropriate and intimidating. The desert environment, with its extreme heat and dust storms, was also seen as a harsh setting for children. Critics argued that these emergency intake sites, while better than Border Patrol stations, were a poor substitute for the small, state-licensed shelters that are better equipped to provide a nurturing environment. The Fort Bliss model was seen as prioritizing efficiency and scale over the best interests of the child. In response to these criticisms, government officials and contractors running the site insisted they were doing their best under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. They highlighted the immense logistical challenge of caring for an unprecedented number of children, and emphasized that the primary goal was to move them out of dangerous Border Patrol facilities as quickly as possible. However, the fundamental critiques remained. The challenges faced at Fort Bliss exposed the deep strains within the U.S. immigration system and the difficult trade-offs involved in managing a humanitarian crisis at the border. The story of Fort Bliss is more than just a story about one facility. It is a microcosm of the broader U.S. approach to immigration. It reflects a system that is largely reactive, scrambling to respond to crises as they arise rather than proactively managing migration flows. The need for a massive temporary site like Fort Bliss highlights the chronic underfunding and lack of capacity in the established immigration infrastructure, particularly the network of shelters for unaccompanied children. When faced with a surge in arrivals, the government fell back on an emergency measure that prioritized speed and scale, revealing a system that lacks the flexibility and resources to handle predictable fluctuations in migration humanely and efficiently. The operation at Fort Bliss underscores the deep political divisions that paralyze immigration reform. The facility became a political symbol used by critics of the administration to highlight a so-called crisis at the border, and by supporters as evidence of a more humane approach than the previous administration's policies. This political polarization makes it incredibly difficult to have a nuanced conversation about long-term solutions. Instead of focusing on fixing the root causes of migration or adequately funding the asylum system, the debate often devolves into partisan finger-pointing. Fort Bliss, in this sense, is a physical manifestation of a policy stalemate, a temporary patch on a system in need of a fundamental overhaul. Looking forward, experts and advocates are discussing a range of potential reforms. Many argue for a significant investment in the standard network of small state-licensed shelters, which are widely seen as providing a higher standard of care. This would require long-term planning and funding to build capacity so that the system is not overwhelmed by future increases in arrivals. Others focus on addressing the processing backlogs. This could involve hiring more immigration judges and asylum officers, and streamlining the vetting process for sponsors to move children out of government custody and into family homes more quickly, which is the ultimate goal for all parties involved. Ultimately, the experience at Fort Bliss serves as a critical case study. It demonstrates the limits of an emergency-based response and highlights the human cost of a broken immigration system. Any meaningful reform will require moving beyond temporary solutions and tackling the issue at its core. This involves not only improving infrastructure at the border, but also engaging in regional diplomacy to address the root causes of migration, violence, corruption, and lack of economic opportunity that compel people, including children, to leave their homes in the first place. The future of U.S. immigration policy will be determined by whether policymakers can learn the lessons of Fort Bliss and commit to building a more resilient, humane, and functional system.